Welcome back to our visit to Epcot, if the original plans for an entire city were actually built. In today's episode, we'll talk a little bit about how this whole thing was made, cover the rest of the city that we didn't visit last time, and start delving into some of the interesting lessons that this model can show us. If you somehow made it here without seeing that first episode, a card should be popping up right about now. It'll also be part of the Sightlines playlist on our channel, which contains all the episodes from the series if you're watching on a format that doesn't support cards. Before we continue our tour from last time, I want to take a moment to look at how this model was made. First, I matched the aerial map plan from the 1966 introductory film Walt made for his Florida project to the land today as it appears on Google Maps. Once I had a fairly accurate overlay, I started putting a grid over the plan. This allowed me to take the known size of a grid in-game, in kilometers, and make an accurate grid on the plan map to correspond to it. Once that was done, I went square by square and replicated the natural layout of the land, and man-made layout in the case of the Bay Lake extensions. Note that I couldn't put enough trees in because of the game's limit on how many total trees we can have. Then came the broad connections like I-4, some railroad, and most importantly, the highway into the Disney property. Then I switched to an unlimited game mode and built the city as you would any other in this game, placing roads, zoning, putting in services and specialty buildings, electric, water, etc., etc. All the while, I compared the game's city with the gridded version I made of the original plans to try and make sure everything went roughly where it was supposed to. The largest chunk of time was spent tweaking everything to give it the best chance to work as the design intended. Obviously, putting a bunch of useless stoplights at small intersections along a busy highway would just ruin traffic flow and is unfair to the design. There are dozens of small things like that which needed to be adjusted before we got to this point of the final city. And there are all kinds of other pieces we could tweak to change this even further. As we pointed out last episode, this isn't a super accurate simulation or anything, it's just a game. And this is all just for entertainment. Anyway, let's return to our tour of the city from the previous episode. It's 1975, and the city is less than a year old. After spending the night in the Cosmopolitan Hotel, we've been invited to visit a home on one of the suburban petals on the edge of the city's flower shape. We board a people mover downstairs below the hotel. In the game, that's an underground metro. There just isn't anything that even closely resembles a people mover. Being underground was the only way to fit the stations in the city center and have any other buildings downtown. As in the 1966 plans, the People Mover runs from downtown to a station on the other side of the Greenbelt. From these stations, the tracks split into two lines, each traveling up its own petal of the city's suburbs. In our version, this is where the tracks finally move above ground to match Disney's design. There are two stations on each petal, one nearer the city center and the other at the very end. We ride the People Mover out to the end of its loop, past all the houses on this particular petal. The home we're visiting is out at the very end, which gives an amazing view of the city in the distance as we look back from the station. The house we're visiting sits on the arc of the petal, a few doors down from the intersection with the ring road that encompasses the entire city. It has a brand new, experimental car from Ford in the driveway, a video doorbell from RCA, and a whole suite of automated appliances from GE in the kitchen. It has a single electric heat pump for both air conditioning and heat, as well as a solar-charged, battery-powered mower for the lawn. The yard opens up to the large green space in the middle of the petal, with a view of a nearby playground. This particular house isn't just a model either. People really live here. The family is part of the Epcot Ambassador program and give tours of their home to prospective homebuyers and future residents of Epcot. After seeing the house, we're invited to take a tour of the Greenbelt led by our gracious hosts. We climb back onto the People Mover, riding it towards the city. We stop by some of the parks, gardens, and city services located in the Greenbelt nearest the host's home. Once again boarding the People Mover, we then visit something that is fairly vague in the 1966 plans, and at the same time get a demonstration of how quick and effective the People Movers are for traveling across town. Over here, along the extended coast of Bay Lake in the far east of the city, is a small beach area. In the game, we've filled this in with a number of parks and special waterfront attractions. It's just a spot on the 1966 plan, and despite our best efforts, we here at Theme Parchive haven't been able to find a single thing explaining what this would have been. I personally like to imagine something akin to the Boardwalk Hotel area today, but intended for the residents of Epcot rather than tourists. Another mystery from the original plan is the residential municipality. It's this section, over here in the corner, right where Disney Springs is today. We've represented it in the model by making a series of neighborhoods along the roads indicated by the plan, but we have no idea how accurate this is. We've also placed some service buildings at the center of the circle because that's what worked best for the game, and we're lacking any specifics about what should be here otherwise. There doesn't seem to be any mention of it anywhere. It's completely absent from the 1966 promotional film. There don't appear to be any pieces of concept art, and we can't even find a single source that references it. If you have a reliable source that speaks to what this was, or why this was, or just anything about it, please let us know in the comments. And that pretty much concludes our tour of the city. If you're anything like me, you're ready to start talking with one of Disney's real estate agents about buying a home here. Unfortunately, we can't do that. And maybe we don't want to. Instead, let's turn our attention to how this design works in terms of city planning. There are a few markers we can point to for how accurate our model is at replicating the 1966 site plan. The population is pretty much on point. One major issue is that Walt maintained that everyone living in the city would have a job, and that there would be no retirees. It's hard to know if that would have been legal or even feasible, or if after a couple decades living and working in the city, exceptions would have been made for longtime cast members, or for Disney company executives like Walt, his brother Roy, his brother-in-law Bill Cottrell, or any of their families. In our video game city, we can't prevent retirees, so having a slightly higher total population to account for them is probably acceptable. And that is exactly what we have. The original plan called for 20,000 citizens, and our model fluctuates between 20,000 and 30,000. And that's with all the extra housing in the residential municipality, presuming that that wasn't calculated to be part of the 20,000 living in the city. Who knows? In addition to the fairly accurate population numbers, the total workers in some regions of the city are also pretty on point. As we mentioned last episode, the total workers in the theme park and resort areas are about 1,000 more than the number of employees the resort had at its 1971 opening. Considering that the plans called for several more resort hotels than were eventually built, our excess 1,000 workers might actually be too few. For total jobs, we've also got a decent accuracy. If every adult had to be employed like Walt wanted, that would have skewed the population in the city, at least early on, towards younger people and families. If we presume 2 adults and 2 kids per household, that would give us a 50-50 split between workers and non-workers. That's actually fairly optimistic on the average number of kids per household, since the US birth rate had fallen significantly from the highs of the baby boom by 1975, but just 15 years before, in 1960, birth rate was almost 3 times what it was in 1975. That means a lot of established families would have had several children and teens. And while seniors are actually a higher percentage than kids or teens in our simulation, we pretty much have that 50-50 split between working age adults and non-working people. Even the expected distribution of the population is accurate. The plan called for the center of the city to have more people without kids, which is what we see. The outlying petals on the city are by far biased towards families and the elderly compared to the center. Like we noted last episode, we have no way to actually measure the number of tourists in the city. There don't even appear to be any mods available to do this. It's the same story with the number of people using public transit, all because the game tracks these stats in number per week, which is kind of useless when it takes a person weeks to complete a simple trip across town in-game. All that said, we can adjust these numbers and get an idea of how the city's design responds. For example, we can exploit the tourists' inexplicable fixation with the buses down in the Transportation and Welcome Center to trap thousands of them in line. Yeah, they will literally stand thousands deep to wait for buses that can transport 30 people at a time, rather than use this adjacent metro station with trains that carry 5 times as many people. Like I said at the beginning of the last episode and reiterated a moment ago, this game isn't exactly realistic, and all our conclusions should be taken with a grain of salt. But this bug does allow us to build up thousands of extra tourists, and by deleting those bus routes holding the thousands of them back, turn the trickle of tourists arriving in the city into a flood. This might simulate the traffic for one of the big holidays in the parks, like the 4th of July or Christmas, or maybe the opening of a new theme park or land like Animal Kingdom or Galaxy's Edge. Basically, any time where parks like the Magic Kingdom could actually reach their attendance limits, we can simulate with a flood of visitors. Doing this, we unsurprisingly see a huge line forming at the monorail station in the Transportation and Welcome Center. But this creates problems further down the line. To see what I'm talking about, let's follow a typical citizen from their home out in one of the pedals to the theme park resort area where they work. Here, at the outermost station, foot traffic is relatively light, and we really only need to wait for the next train, which doesn't even fill up. At the next stop, the train fills a little more, but not completely full. At the next stop, we switch lines to join the people riding in from the adjacent pedal. This essentially doubles the amount of people on our train. Given how the stations join here in the plans, it's hard to say what was intended. It could be that our train would continue to the center of the city, and thus we didn't need to change trains. This would have the benefit of shortening the time our trip takes. It also means fewer new passengers per train. But that means this and the center station have to deal with twice as many trains as the stations out in the pedals. And this station also needs complex switching mechanisms to transfer trains between the 2 tracks out into the pedals. If that was even possible within the People Mover system, it would have required a lot of work to maintain and balance. Regardless, when we get to the city center and disembark our train, we find ourselves in a crowd of every other person coming to the transit hub from all the other pedals in the city. And don't forget, this is also supposed to be a convention center, hotel, and access point for the International Shopping District, which is practically a small theme park in itself. The foot traffic here would have been insane, and the nature of the monorail system means there would have been long lines to board a train during the busiest parts of the day. We can see part of this problem with the flood of tourists we've unleashed. Every arriving monorail train is full, and there's no room for anyone else who is traveling to the theme park/resort area. Granted, there could be special reserved trains running just for employees or those from this station, but again, that just creates more traffic on the tracks. Even without unleashing a tsunami of tourists on the city, this is the busiest station in the entire model, and that makes sense. It was designed to be. But it's not great that all the employees and all the visitors end up waiting in long lines because the demand to reach the resort area is so high. It's possible this could be somewhat alleviated by making the trip up to the resort its own dedicated line, kind of like how the Resort Loop and Epcot trains are on separate lines at the TTC today. That said, this isn't a good solution. It just means that instead of full trains bypassing this station, they have to unload their passengers in the hub to switch lines, basically adding these passengers from the motel and industrial areas to the monorail queue to get to the resort area. At the end of the day, this is just a fundamental flaw in the design. When demand for the monorails to the theme park exceeds capacity, it is always going to create a problem, and this station is always going to suffer the most. And it's not easy to solve because the capacity of the station is pretty limited and would be difficult to expand based on the current design. It's not like they could add extra track to accommodate loading and unloading multiple trains at a time. The entire station would have been built into the building and constrained by its original dimensions. Out of all the conclusions we're drawing from this model, this is the only one I'm really, truly willing to put my neck out on, even if it's controversial. It's a bit of putting all your eggs in one basket. The design may be simple and elegant, but once it's built, it would be impossible to scale as demand grew. It's literally sandwiching the monorail between the hotel and the people movers. Opening a second theme park on the same monorail line would have been insane, maybe even impossible. And even only servicing the demand of today's Magic Kingdom, it's doubtful employees would find it feasible to take the monorail into the resort area as their primary means of travel to and from work, especially on days where rope drop draws huge crowds. And that's not counting what happens when portions of the monorail need to close for extended maintenance, as was done at the Polynesian Resort for the 50th anniversary celebration. Now, the entire city center is, at best, off the monorail network. And at worst, if it's work on the actual track itself, it's preventing the monorail from traveling at all. The queue times are less of a problem in the monorail loop at the themed resort area. Monorail traffic here flows pretty quickly, just like in the resort loop today. Traffic builds up less at all the stations here. This is largely due to the fact that it's a loop and has a larger number of stops. The loop allows more convenient traffic flow in either direction, having the demand per train. This compounds with the fact that if one direction's line is too long, taking the train in the other direction only means waiting through a few extra stops. Adding 15 minutes to your trip to save an hour waiting in line is probably worth it for most passengers, so traffic will tend to smooth out even with delays. The larger number of stops also means that more trains can operate without waiting for the previous train to depart at any of the stations. Because of all these factors, the main station on the resort loop regularly services more passengers than the same stop of the central monorail. Another benefit is that maintenance or a breakdown in one direction of the loop doesn't necessarily preclude travel in the other direction. Half capacity is still better than none. All of those concerns aside, Walt's dream of Epcot being a primarily pedestrian city rings true. Pedestrian traffic is pretty solid everywhere, but especially in the motel, city center, and resort areas. That makes sense, since these would be the highest traffic areas for the monorail as well. We're also fighting the game a bit here. It's not got a way to limit or prevent passenger cars on roads without using mods. And it's hard to tell, but it doesn't appear that the game replaces banned car traffic with pedestrians if mods are used. Car traffic is especially problematic in the motel area, since that's where most of the tourists are arriving. Not banning cars from spawning at the airport, train station, and other transportation buildings down here results in a deluge of cars headed for the city. There's really no way to manage these, and eventually, they become a traffic jam that prevents even the buses from moving, meaning everything down here comes to a complete stop. This is worst in the vanilla unmodded experience. Using a popular traffic mod, we can ban all private vehicles, essentially forcing all remaining tourists to use the monorail to enter the city. This clears traffic enormously. Another traffic hotspot is the deliveries to the downtown area. This is where Walt's plan called for underground stations for trucks to park in, deliver their loads, and pull off. Aside from the safety concerns of building up carbon monoxide in this underground space, there's the problem of traffic. These trucks would have to supply the entire city of 20,000 people with food and consumables like toiletries and laundry soap, not to mention supplying the stores and restaurants in the International Shopping District and hotel. And that's not even mentioning maintenance vehicles and city services like fire and police and ambulances. It's highly improbable that the deliveries would have been as effective as Walt imagined, especially considering that the idea of building them underground in a swampy part of Central Florida is, well, dubious at best. And building everything on top of them, like the utilidors of Magic Kingdom, would have raised the cost of the whole project exponentially. Not to mention that it would have made stormwater drainage a nightmare. Imagine a hurricane hitting the elevated city with water having nowhere to go but to lower areas, meaning the city's suburban petals. But it's not a great idea to draw too many conclusions from the traffic issues in this game. Of all the parts of a city that this game doesn't simulate well, especially when the numbers get higher, traffic is the worst. Even with mods installed, you still get moments of weirdness, like when all the drivers decide to collapse down to a single lane on the game's equivalent of an interstate highway for no apparent reason. Seriously, there's no accident blocking the way, no dire need to merge for an important exit or a particularly busy on-ramp, nothing like that. They're literally just avoiding being in the lane closest to an exit because they can. Improved AI does help this, but it's not a panacea. So again, we should be cautious in drawing too many conclusions on the car traffic issue. One of the more interesting considerations we can draw conclusions on is noise pollution. The way the game visualizes noise does a pretty good job of answering a question about the design that I always had. You can hear the noise from the People Mover if you ride it in the Magic Kingdom, and it's not exactly silent. Sure, it's not anywhere near as loud as a traditional metro train, but it's loud enough to be a possible nuisance late at night, especially if there's no sound barrier between your home and the track. It's possible that city management would have shut down the People Movers late at night, but that seems antithetical to the idea of a pedestrian-focused city. In that case, it's kinda more like pedestrian-focused until 9 p.m. and then if you gotta go somewhere, just drive a car. And the 1966 film implies the People Movers will run 24/7 while also calling them silent, so take that for what it's worth. Another point on the noise issue is the design of the highway. I used to live in a condo about as far from an interstate in a large city as these houses, but that was with the benefit of a small forest of trees and large sound-deflecting walls on the highway itself. Even then, the sound of traffic was constantly audible outside, and even more so at night. The design for Epcot, especially if we go based on the Progress City model, doesn't seem to have any noise suppression for the homes on the pedals nearest the highway. The fact that every truck delivering to the city or theme park/resort area would have to pass along here? It's not promising either. Noise would also be a problem in the downtown apartment areas. If you lived in one of the apartments facing the International Shopping District, all the music, conversation, and general traffic noise would be even worse than a normal city because it's trapped and echoing inside of the enclosed dome or skylights. It's questionable what kind of natural light, if any, these apartments would get unless they were on the exterior side facing the greenbelt. The final question that I really wanted to answer with this model was whether or not fireworks from Magic Kingdom would be visible at night from the houses out in the pedals. And the answer is maybe. Kinda. It depends. As we saw at the end of the last episode, fireworks are definitely visible from the Cosmopolitan Hotel in the center of the city. Out in the suburbs, it depends on how close you are to the Magic Kingdom park, how tall your house is, what kind of tree cover's in the way, how clear the weather is, etc. We can't get down to street level with the camera in this game, but we can simulate what it would be like to sit on the roof of a 2-story house. From the further half of the circle, nothing's visible. From about the midpoint, you can start to see lights through the trees, but it's tough. From the point closest to the park, they're actually pretty clear. So yeah, it would have been possible to be one of the lucky residents of Epcot that could see fireworks from their bedroom window every night. And that is definitely cool. So that's it for our exploration of this version of Epcot. By the time this episode goes live, it should be available on the Steam Workshop and doesn't use any of the DLC, so if you've got the City Skylines base game and want to check it out for yourself, feel free to try it out. Aside from that, if you've liked this series, please consider liking the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of the other videos we've got. And if you've got any questions about the city and how it works, or how it was made, or any observations of your own, please let us know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey friends, thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Here's a couple more you might like, and if you would, please hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up. It literally costs you nothing except a few seconds, and it truly helps us make more videos like this one. An extra special thanks go out to the people helping us over on Patreon. It's because of their support that you're seeing this video right now. If you want to help the channel out even more, head over to our Patreon and check it out. You can find it through a link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we hope you have a great day.